Hello, I'm Mike Ortez, if you prefer, and on behalf of Dr. Sean and Deb, I'd like to welcome you to Jester Politics' sixth video in our series on the Constitution. This one's the attacks on our free speech. I think it'd be fair to say, well, an understatement to say that in recent years there's been quite a few attacks on our free speech. However, this is nothing new, and it dates back to, well, just shortly after the adoption of the Bill of Rights. In 1791, the First Amendment as part of the Bill of Rights was adopted. It's only 45 words and protects 5 fundamental rights from government infringement. And one of those rights is free speech, which is protected by, you guessed it, the Free Speech Clause, which is 10 words. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Pretty straightforward and clear, hard to misinterpret that. And yet our government has consistently violated it since, well, 7 years after it was adopted, believe it or not. In 1797, John Adams became our second president, and he and his Federalist Party controlled both the presidency and Congress. However, Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party was making major gains, so Adams and the Federalists used the crisis with the French as an excuse to pass what was called the Sedition Act of 1798. There's no doubt that this act was intended to target Democratic Republicans. Section 2 of this act criminalized any speech that was false, scandalous, or malicious directed at the government of the United States, either House of Congress, or the President of the United States. Of course, under this act, it was completely okay to engage in false, scandalous, or malicious speech directed against the Vice President of the United States because, surprise, 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 that happened to be Jefferson, the head of the Democratic Republicans. Further, the sanctions for violating this act were quite severe. A person could be sentenced to 2 years in jail and or fined $2,000, which in today's money is $51,318. That's quite a lot of money for calling somebody a jackass. Additionally, the Federalists were quite enthusiastic about enforcing this new act of theirs. In 3 years, or just under 3 years, they sent at least 25 people to jail, including a sitting congressman who won re-election from his jail cell, a state legislature, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, and 20 editors and reporters from Democratic Republican leaning newspapers. But the most hapless of the ones that went to jail were two dudes who having some barley pops in a local tavern when one of them made a joke about wanting to see a cannon fire a cannonball up John Adams' arse. Yeah, they went to jail too. What I find most amazing about this act is that John Adams and Alexander Hamilton were two of the primary movers getting this act through Congress, and they were both founding fathers who not 7 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified, completely ignored our free speech rights. Luckily, in the next elections, the Federalists and Adams were swept from power, never to return. When Jefferson assumed the presidency in 1801, he allowed the Sedition Act of 1798 to expire and pardoned all those who were convicted under it. The next attack on free speech rights came in the Civil War. Now, all reasonable people have to agree that during wartime, the government has legitimate reasons to restrict the speech as far as military secrets that, if disclosed, will get people killed. However, Lincoln went far beyond this, and on August 7, 1861, he issued an executive order, the language of which could be and was construed to mean that any newspaper that published editorials critical of the war or calling for a negotiated peace or even just covering protests against the war was unlawful. Following the issuance of this executive order, it's estimated that somewhere between 200 and 300 newspapers were shut down in the North. Now, that doesn't mean that Lincoln personally shut them down or even knew that these papers were shut down, but many of them were shut down by administrative and military officials pursuant to this executive orders, and it seems a lot of them were probably shut down or ransacked by vigilantes that opposed their pacifist or anti-war editorials. However, Lincoln did order two newspapers to be shut down for publishing what turned out to be a forged proclamation calling for another 400,000 people to be drafted. Additionally, they used other methods, they being the administration, to suppress the press, including notifying them that they were being investigated. There was a grand jury investigation into their activities and denying them the ability to use the U.S. mail system. No sooner had we got through the Civil War and the newspapers started getting back to normal than a guy named Anthony Comstock, who was an anti-obscenity crusader, and in 1873 he got Congress to pass the Comstock Act, making it unlawful to mail obscene material through the U.S. mails. Of course, what's obscene was quite broad and included information information or ads involving contraceptives, contraceptive devices, anything related to abortion, and even books talking about male and female reproductive systems. Comstock then got himself appointed as a special agent for the U.S. mails, where he spent 42 years prosecuting people involved in sending what he considered obscenities through the mail. And in that 42 years, he had 4,000 convictions, 160 tons of books were destroyed, and he used to brag that 15 suspects of his committed suicide. The only part of this law that was repealed by Congress was the part dealing with contraceptives, and they repealed that in 1971. Though the Comstock Act has not been repealed, the Supreme Court has significantly narrowed its applicability by limiting what is defined or can be defined as obscenities under the First Amendment, and that case was decided in 1973 in Miller v. California. Initially, I was going to do just one video on infringement on First Amendment rights. Unfortunately, the government has infringed on our free speech rights so often that I found it necessary to break this into two. So I'm going to close this up with just a couple of thoughts, and we'll pick up again on the next video, starting with the 20th century. First, I'd like to point out that in the 109 years from the time our Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791 to the end of the 19th century, 109 years, the government implemented 3 laws spanning 24 years that significantly infringed on free speech rights that were not necessary for national security. Second, I'd like to point out that this was a bipartisan effort on behalf of both the Republicans and Democrats. And finally, I'd like to point out that there's a theme developing where the government will use crises that are either made up or real and or morality to push restrictions on our free speech rights. With that, I'll close up this part of the attacks on our free speech rights and hope to see you next time. From the gang at Jester Politics, hope you have a great day and see you soon. Bye.